Welcome back to the 𝐷𝐿𝐒𝐼𝐿 podcast. I am once again your host, Jon Schwabish. Hope you're having a nice start to fall. Hope you are safe if you are down in the southeastern part of the United States where we just had a hurricane blow through. I'm excited for this week's episode of the show. I've got Zach Bowders on the show. You might know Zach as the host of the Data Plus Love podcast. Zach and I had a lot of fun in this one. Not just because we got to get back together after seeing each other at the Tableau conference a few months ago, but because we recorded the conversation you're going to hear today, and then we flipped roles, and Zach interviewed me, and you can listen to that episode on his podcast, Data Plus Love. I'll link to it in the show notes. But for this part of that kind of almost 2-hour conversation, I talked to Zach about a few things. First off, we talk about his perspectives on data visualization rule makers and rule breakers. So we talk about data visualization rules. I put that in quotes depending on your perspective. And we talk about Zach's perspective on rules in the data visualization field. We also talk about his thoughts on dashboard creation. What does it mean to make a dashboard? Are people doing too much when they're creating dashboards? Do featured dashboards that you see out there in the Tableau world, in the Power BI world, on social media, do they promote too many flashy things that aren't actually helping people make decisions? So we talk a lot about that. And then we also talk about inspiration, and we talk about plagiarism, inspiration, copying, and an homage to data visualization. So we talk about a lot. There's a lot going on here. It's a really fun conversation. I think you're going to learn a lot. I think you're going to enjoy this. Zach is really fun to chat with. So I hope you listen to this. And then when you're done, head on over to his show, Data Plus Love. Subscribe to both channels. Make sure you listen to that one so you can hear me talk about some of the things that he wanted to pester me on. So hope you enjoy that. Here's my conversation with Zach, only on the 𝐷𝐿𝐼𝐿 podcast. Zach. How you doing, buddy?
It's going great, John. How are you?
It's good. Good to see you again. Let's see. We saw each other Tableau conference, which was
That
May?
is correct. I met you over jelly beans.
Oh, right. That is the one thing I will give props to, of many other things, to Tableau conference is the snacks are pretty good.
You have to have a strong snack game to keep people engaged. You're doing long days, and you're plying them with lots of alcohol in the evenings, so you want to keep that sugar high rolling during the day.
Yes, I also appreciate the fact. I think last year in Vegas that it was a Pepsi town, but they had Diet Coke in the room, which I really appreciated their understanding for us Diet Coke aficionados.
Wow, I did. Okay, first of all, the fact that you even recognized like the branding of a town or a region was impressive to me. But like I never even picked up on that. So that's how dedicated you are.
I'm dedicated, and it's gotten. I'll say it's gotten worse because somehow Pepsi has the contract for all like the major airports. So at DC National and DC Dulles, when I fly out, it's just Pepsi products. So you have to wait to get onto your flight to actually get the your soda of choice, which is a real shame. It's a real shame. Anyway, you've got a lot of stuff going on these days.
I try. I dabble.
You dabble. So let's talk about a few things I've seen you've been talking about here and there. You have this post in your Substack about rule breakers and rule makers, and so I'm curious about your take on those two groups, and also how you think about rules when it comes to data viz. Like, do you subscribe to their strict rules, or is it pretty loosey-goosey?
I was sort of inspired. I came up with this post, and I've sort of expanded on it a couple times, revisiting it back when Top Gun Maverick came out, which was a movie that I don't think anyone had high hopes for, because you're making a sequel to a 1980s movie that was kind of a cult classic. Like, you're not expecting much. And it was kind of the movie that ended up saving theaters because everyone had tanked during COVID and they needed money. But watching Top Gun Maverick, one of the things that sort of inspired me, and this is really weird that I'm sitting there in the theater thinking this, but Maverick should be like, an admiral or a senator or something. Right. Like, he's pushing 60, but he still wants to be a pilot. And he has been tapped to teach younger versions of him how to fly what is effectively billed as a suicide mission. Like, we need this thing done. We don't expect all the pilots to make it out. And here's how you're going to teach it. But as a highly skilled individual contributor, Maverick sort of recognizes things that can be done that the top brass don't necessarily recognize. Like he's totally familiar with the aircrafts, their capabilities, what pilots can pull off. And he has his own way of teaching from the middle, sort of like leading from the middle. And that's sort of where this sort of thing started for me. And then I started thinking about the two personas of the characters in the Top Gun series. There's the Mavericks, which are the people that sort of push the boundaries and, sort of want to push things to their limit and see how far they can go. And then there's the Iceman, who's the by the books kind of rule maker guy who understands what you should be doing, how to do it, and how to execute it perfectly in that way. Mm-hmm. And how in data and in many other fields, honestly, there's sort of a need for both of these things. Because it's very important that we do have best practices, right? There are things that have been tried and tested and work consistently and effectively. And then there are other times when we really need people out there doing weird things that sort of push us forward. Like we come up with new charts like spark lines or comet charts and stuff like that. And if we just followed the books and did stuff the way they'd always been done, we wouldn't have these new tools. And while many of these new tools or new practices may not always be useful, there may be a use case where they're the perfect thing. And while many of these rules and best practices are usually effective, they're not always effective. And there are some times where you might have to pivot, change your perspective, or do something different.
So one thing that I debate this in my head a bit because when I teach folks, I'm like, okay, so pie chart should sum to 100%. I sort of say, like, is that a rule or is that just like, if to me, I'm like, that's just common sense. Like it should just like sum to 100%. So are there things within sort of the existing, I guess, corpus of data viz that you subscribe to that you're like, you should never, ever do this bad thing or this other thing?
It's funny because when I started writing these, at the time, there was somebody that really saw me as a real maverick. Like they thought I just had no regard for rules and sanity. And in reality, I think most people are a synthesis of both of these things. Like very few people are wholly rule-based and very few people are, I recognize no rules. I think for me, one thing that I had seen someone touting a dashboard, and on this dashboard, they were using donut charts to represent percentage change over time. And this set off all these alarm bells for me. And I was like, well, your percentage change could be greater than 100%. And it could also be a negative number. Like this is an ineffective chart for this. So it's like, that was a very clear case of like the Iceman and me being like, that's not a great chart for this. And there are other times where, like, let's say someone needs you to create a sort of navigational tool, and you might end up using a BI tool to essentially create a UI, which is definitely not an out-of-the-box functionality. That's a real maverick move, but it's something that knowing the capabilities of the tool and what people can recognize with a common user interface that I can build this thing. And while it's not typical of what you might use this for, it's definitely an effective use of that. So it's like those are two different cases where it's two entirely different things, but sort of recognizing that sometimes there is a need to flex past what is sort of recognized as the standard. And there are other times where this thing is sort of out of standard. It's probably needs to be something more conservative.
Right. So you use the word effective there, which is kind of the language that I like to use, like effectiveness, clarity, not like simple or good or bad, because as you just mentioned, it depends on who your audience is and what you're doing. For you, and I'm just looking at your background, right? You've got like this cool bee swarm chart and you've got this like radial chart. Like for you, when you think about breaking out of the standard, whatever, the show me tab in Tableau or the drop down in Excel, like do you have some go-to graphs that you go to first as like beyond the lines and bars and pies?
I think it really comes down to your data type, what you're exploring and what you're trying to understand. So I've really been in love with network diagrams lately. And a lot of that's because it's something that has gotten a lot easier very, very recently. So I'm able to turn them out quickly, understand if it's a good use of a network diagram or not. I tried making an NCAA Final Four bracket using a network diagram, and it worked, but it wasn't effective. I also tried doing a family tree using one, and it was disastrous. It was wholly ineffective. It was a bad use case, but I was like, you know what? I tried it. It didn't work. It's like what I learned was that this doesn't work this way. I mean, there might be a way to do it, but I didn't learn that way. So it's, I think, was it Edison that said he learned like 10,000 ways how not to create a light bulb? I think sometimes it's important to have those opportunities for failure, whether it be necessarily through your work product that you're delivering at work or through your extracurricular activities, to take some swings out there, see what works and what doesn't. And at the end of the day, even if you just learned that doesn't work, that's one thing you've eliminated in the future.
You mentioned dashboards earlier, and since you are neck deep, ear deep in the Tableau world, and you've written about dashboard design and effective dashboards, how do you think about these sort of best practices in the dashboarding world? Because I think one thing I hear from folks is like, well, I can create a more complicated, maybe less familiar graph because people have the opportunity to filter, click, hover, and they can sort of learn through the interaction how to read the graph. But I wonder if you approach it in that way.
I think standards are the sort of bumper lanes of learning. So like if you're at the bowling alley, you know, they can put those things that pop up on the gutters that keep the kids from just throwing gutter balls all day long. And I think they're highly effective for sort of bringing people along and teaching them, teaching them best practices. So for example, if you create a dashboard template where there's always a header and a footer and stuff like that, that's very effective for getting people used to the idea that I probably need to say what this is and I should have a date on it somewhere so people know when it's from. They may not even be thinking about these things consciously, but as the person building it, it's sort of ingraining that. And also for the user, it's teaching them like, I should probably understand what this thing is before I start reading it. And I should probably look down there to see if it's even current. But I think it all begins with audience and understanding what people will and won't understand, and also understanding what they're looking for out of it. So I always tell sort of people I'm mentoring, like, don't just read the requirements document and go start doing that, because it's like you don't necessarily understand what they're actually looking for. They've told you this, but what you really need to start understanding is the kind of decisions they're going to need to make based off of this. And then look at what they've asked for and say, does that actually deliver that? Because you can perfectly execute on a requirements document and create something that is an abysmal failure. And that's sort of the difference between someone that is like just a pure IT technician that's just going to deliver on requirements like an engineer, and an analyst who needs to be more thoughtful and sort of insert themselves in the process between sort of the end product and the user and say, but what are we really trying to get to here? Like, what do you actually need to know? Because I can give you those things that you asked for, but that doesn't get what you need.
Right. Can you talk a little bit more when you're working with students or clients and you have this requirement document? Like, it sounds like it's almost like just slightly insufficient to sort of get all the answers that you need when it comes to building something for someone.
I typically assume they are. I think that's the most reasonable place to start.
Okay.
It's very rare that your client knows everything that they need, because oftentimes they're not an expert in how to communicate the data. They might be an expert in the processes or the business that they work within, but they may not necessarily know the best ways to communicate that. So you might get something where someone says, I need a pie chart that shows this. What they're trying to understand is the parts to a whole representation of something. And in their head, the pie chart is how you represent that. You could make the pie chart that shows that, but if they're asking for something that shows 50 different products, like that pie chart's going to be garbage. It's going to take up a lot of space. It's going to have a million wedges. One or two of them might actually be legible. And you've delivered exactly what they asked for, but it doesn't help them understand it better. If you put that into a histogram or something else, they'd much more easily see all of them. They would be able to see the relative comparison to each of them, and they would all be legible in the, a similar size where all the text is readable and on the page. So that's just a simple example of, sort of interpreting what they're saying and sort of abstractly thinking and applying that based on your expertise and knowledge.
So do you have like a document that you ask them to fill out, and then like is your next step after that? So they say, they fill out this document, they say, yeah, I want a pie chart. Is your next step to talk to them so that you can filter it down some more? Is it like another form set of emails? Like what is that? What does that process look like for you?
I think for me, it's almost always a meeting of some kind. So while they may present you with a, hey, this is what we're looking for, going back then and asking questions and not being afraid of sounding foolish or dumb, like asking stupid questions that seem overly simplistic. So I want to make sure I understand when you say X, does it mean X or does it actually mean something else? I previously, before I now work as a consultant with JLL. I work with Fortune 500 companies all over the world. But previously, I spent 13 years working in fundraising for St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. So I primarily worked with a program called Partner in Hope, which is a monthly giving program. So the idea being every month, people's credit cards are debited or they send in a check or something. And we can sort of predict out fundraising for years based on the predictability of these payments across various programs. Right. So when someone would say something like, I want to know what the rate is of Partner in Hope giving, you need to ask, okay, when you say Partner in Hope giving, do you mean the entire program? Do you mean the DRTV function of it? Do you mean checks? Do you mean credit cards? Because the answer can be very different depending on the slice you look at it from. I remember I had a conversation once with someone who's a program manager within that. And I had done some projections for her. And she was looking at it and saying, well, this is wrong because there's 12 months of giving in each year. And I said, right, but not everybody starts on the first month of the year. Many of these people are going to be acquired during the year. So rather than expecting every single, the first month of the year to have all of your gifts hitting there and then continuing throughout the year with attrition dropping off, you're going to have new people coming in later in the year. You're going to have people that only gave one gift and dropped off. And it's sort of being able to use the historical trends of this to project it that, we're able to look at that. So it's one of those things where the common knowledge of there's 12 months in a year, donors give 12 months. I would expect that to happen across all 12 versus the reality of it. Not everybody starts giving in January. Many people will sign up for the first time in June.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, how does that conversation differ when it's, I'll just make this general, like a non-data person versus more of the data analyst person?
I think it's often
like, do you feel like you can use like different terms, maybe be a little more honest with like the data person?
It depends. And I think it's based on their level of comfort and their level of experience. And also, sometimes people have a lot of sort of preconceived notions about their own data and their own processes. And also, perhaps, you might inadvertently be contradicting something that they have previously experienced. So in your own findings, you might have to advocate for something that is not common sense to what they understand. Right. So that's why I always typically do a data exploration process at the beginning of every project where I can sort of show them a subset of their data, do some validation, say, is this look right to you? Is this, based on your understanding of how your stuff works, would you expect cancellations to be this high or is that atypical? So that you can start off with some confidence in what you're actually representing before you even try to approach the topic of visualization. Because if people don't have confidence in the data to begin with, whatever you make with it is also then going to be severely flawed. And you're going to be in a perpetual cycle of validation. And there's never going to be any real buy-in to what you make at the end of the day.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really interesting, I guess, I don't know, challenge that we have when it's working with sort of the non-data folks versus the data folks. I'm also curious on a kind of more of a technical question. So I assume you're spending most of your time in Tableau?
That's correct.
So because this has come up actually more recently over the last few months with folks that I work with who are making dashboards for other folks, and they've been having difficulty sharing the actual, and it might just be what you just said, like the first round, right? The first view. And I'm curious from a technical standpoint, how do you share your dashboard drafts, early versions? Are you putting them on your Tableau like, what about folks who don't want their stuff up in Tableau public? You're working on a desktop. Like how do you do this sort of iteration process with your clients?
I'm fortunate that my clients are, we're I'm working with Fortune 500 companies, but we're all using common server instances.
Mm,
So whatever I share, they can access. We can permission it so that they have access. I mean, I've done teaching outside of this where I've done stuff with like Emory University and stuff like that. And typically for things like that, I can just put it on my Tableau Public and hide it. None
yeah.
of it's sensitive information, but it's like I don't want them accessing stuff in advance. I want them to sort of access it as it becomes relevant to what we're teaching, rather than them just being able to go out and like, oh, I want to see what lesson 3 is, and
Right.
maybe get confused because they haven't had lesson 2 yet.
Yeah.
So I do think that is an interesting challenge. Fortunately, one that I haven't encountered. But I do think that is a unique challenge, because people don't want their stuff necessarily on Tableau Public, because with a flick of the switch, it can accidentally be visible to anyone.
Right.
You also don't necessarily want it to be just on some guy named Dave's desktop, where when Dave
Yeah.
leaves the company, it's gone forever. And if
Yeah.
the company isn't willing to pony up for a server or a cloud instance, I don't know what the best alternate solution is. Maybe, I mean, you're back to looking at cloud storage of some kind, right? Where you keep
Hmm.
common Tableau desktop files somewhere. But many times your users aren't going to have Tableau desktop. They just need to access the thing.
That's the thing. And I do wonder whether the recent change of making Tableau Public, the Tableau Public license where you can save it locally, I wonder if that changes the calculus for folks.
I'd be curious
But
to
yeah, I
learn
mean,
more.
I mean, because there's only, because my first instinct is often like yours, which is let's have a call and I'll walk you through it. But what people often want then is you show them sort of like, here's the overview. Then they want to dive in and explore for themselves, see if it sort of meets their needs and their expectations. And if they don't have it in front of them where they can actually play with it, then you're in this murky world of I'm showing you, but you want to play with it, but I can't get it to you. So how do we like resolve all this? And a lot of the folks that I work with and that we work with at Urban are they're small nonprofits, so they're not going to pony up the 1,500, $2,000 or whatever it is for a Tableau desktop license.
And that also puts you in a position where you're not able to build as interactive a dashboard. You're essentially having to create flat files for them to interact with through email or something. So you're
Yeah.
taking actions off the table. You're taking filters off the table. It's all something where it essentially has to be fully pre-baked, because all they're going to see is an image, as if they were seeing it in a PowerPoint deck.
Yeah. Yeah. These technical challenges are interesting, I think. And I'm curious. I mean, I've heard, a lot of people I talk to, they're using Tableau Server, and I think that resolves a good chunk of it. But I am curious how others are handling maybe the more common, I don't know, maybe it's the more common place where, people are, looking for freelancers or using outside folks to do this sort of stuff. It's a really interesting challenge. Okay. I want to switch gears a little bit, because one of the other interesting things that you've written about and posted on LinkedIn, I think like 3 weeks ago, and then like 2 weeks ago, I posted something similar. And for whatever reason, the two didn't cross, is thoughts on sort of copying versus inspiration versus plagiarism. And so you have sort of a background story on this, and then some, and which is on the post. But I'm curious if maybe you could tell that story. We could talk a little bit about this Venn diagram, overlapping lines. Not really sure how to draw it out, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So my story was last summer, and I like to dabble in all sorts of different topics and all sorts of viz types and stuff. So I love when I find a topic and you find a niche chart that you can use for it that you don't typically use, because that's always a fun application. So it was it wasn't last summer that I made it, but last summer was when this happened. So I'd
Mm-hmm.
seen a data set that was about the changing sales across the music industry and how mediums are constantly shifting. So, going from vinyl to 8-track to cassette and CD, and then how digital is the predominant force in the market right now, but vinyl is still kind of hanging on and coming back.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd created this stream graph about it. And at the time I was like, oh, that was a really cool use of that. And it looks great. And it's really effective to understand where stuff comes and goes and how the market expands and contracts. And it was last summer. I know this because I was on the way to a cookout. My wife was doing a gathering with a friend of hers, and I'm on the way there. And on the way there, I see from a sort of a data like news service, essentially. I'm not going to name names because they're not the bad guy here. I'm the bad guy.
Right. Okay. All right.
I'm setting that expectation forward. So I see that they have recently published the same data set using the same chart type, and it was nearly identical to mine, which you would expect because it's the same data set and the same chart type.
Sure.
So I saw this, and previously having been spurned by this organization, which I had submitted work to, my first feeling was, I can't believe you copied me. Like you turn me down and then you copy one of my things.
Right.
So in my frustration and my haste on the way to a cookout, I put up a tweet like, you copied my thing and you turned me down. I can't believe it. And by the time I'm at the cookout, I have no Wi-Fi. I have no connection wherever I am for whatever reason. My phone's not working. But the last message I see is from my friend and fellow tableau visionary Lindsay Betzendahl saying, yeah, so-and-so did that 2 years before you did. And I immediately, it's like getting hit with a ton of bricks because you realize the kind of assumptions that you put forward, which is, look, I did this thing. It's kind of a niche chart. It's a specific data set. I did this and they did this. And the other example was the exact same data set also. So all three of us had done stream graphs of the same thing. And having said that, I had no prior knowledge to the other version. I was like, oh. And I immediately realized how uncharitable I had been with my interpretation of the series of events. Probably because I had felt personally burned by this place before. But in thinking about it, I realized that as data professionals and understanding the tools that we have at our disposal with different charts and stuff, this is a very obvious chart type for this particular thing. And in fact, when I went back, and I think you saw it in my LinkedIn post, I found other examples of the same chart type used for the same data set. Because when you're a data person and you know what you can make and you see this thing, the shape of it becomes very logical. Oh, this is one of my options. Not everybody did that. Other people did area charts and other things, but many people did. And I realized, oh, what I clearly thought was a case of plagiarism is more of a case of this is logical. And I realized how often and how easy this can happen, and based on what we interpret as how uncharitable it can be. And that's not to say that work doesn't get copied. So if you go on Tableau Public and type in John Wick, you'll see vises by me, David Kelly, and Kate Schaub, who each of us took on one of the John Wick movies. And then you'll see a dozen copies of each of those, where people have copied it, changed one or two things, and republished it. I personally don't care that much. I think it's great if anyone wants to download something. I don't feel like it's a threat to my reputation. I don't think it says anything about what I can do. Because I know what I can do, and I've got plenty of track record and experience. And more often than not, in fact, I would say 99% of the time, if you decide to call someone out for plagiarism, you will end up being the bad guy. Because more often than not, it's more than likely harmless. So another example might be Andy Kriebel famously adapted the Financial Times visual vocabulary into Tableau. It's the most viewed thing they have on there. It's got literal millions of views, but many, 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 many people download and republish it. And the uncharitable interpretation that would be, this person wants to present this as if they made it. What I would probably take as the more realistic example, much like my John Wick things, is somebody thought this was interesting. They don't know how to make it themselves and would like to understand it better. They may or may not understand how to bookmark this, but they would like to take it and kind of mess with it and see what can be done. And I think that is probably the healthiest for all people interpretation of anything that feels like plagiarism. It's not always the case. There are people out there that will take other people's work and try to present it as their own. The upside of this is it almost always burns them because they're not able to deliver the thing that they act like they can do.
Right. Yeah. The post that I had was a really interesting case. It was from the European Correspondent, which is a relatively new volunteer-led news organization, and I have really come to love their visuals, right? Like every day you get a newsletter, and I'll be honest, I rarely read all the text because it's about Europe and I'm in the US, and but their data viz is really good. And they had a visual of terrorist attacks, and it was, the title was something like Terrorism's Bloody Toll. right? And it had this like red bar chart, inverted vertical bar chart, and it was all red, and it like was really evocative of Simon Scar's visualization from years ago, Iraq's bloody toll. I mean, even down to that title, right? And so, but I wasn't sure because an inverted axis is not the most uncommon thing to see, but with the combination of the title and the inverted bar. So I asked this question on Twitter, and I think, or on LinkedIn, and I think a lot of people said, this is pretty blatant. And fortunately, the EC folks wrote in and they were like, yeah, we were inspired by Simon's stuff, and this is what we did. And so then it becomes a practical, like, then there's this weird, like, I was inspired by this great work, I want to use it. Do I need to cite it? How should I cite it? Then you get into these practical weeds of like, should I just write inspired by? Like, where should that go? So, yeah, it's a really interesting question, I think. And I think it's also, where do we draw the line between what is sort of in the canon of visualizations versus what's kind of like, what's the new thing, right? Like bar charts, line charts, we're not citing Playfair. But so I don't know where this line is of whether there is a line, inspiration versus plagiarism versus an homage, right, to someone else's work.
I think that's a great example because, in the field of art, there are many people that are homaging someone else or taking a technique learned from someone else. Like, if no one ever stood on the shoulders of anyone else, our field would be absolute garbage and everyone would just be generating their own things. We would never be progressing and learning. And that goes back to that sort of Iceman and Mavericks dynamic I was talking about. But I think like it's very important that people feel safe to be able to use an idea. I don't know where the threshold is for crediting or calling out. I don't know when it becomes copying versus homage versus learn. Like, I mean, if you use a spark line, do you have to mention Edward Tufte every time? You probably don't. But like, if you use that in conjunction with something else, does it then become something you need to attribute? And I think it's just such a murky gray area. I don't think there's a clear answer. Like I enjoy comic books a lot. So if you did say a cover where you're recreating a very similar image from something else, they'll typically put after so-and-so because you're clearly homaging whatever. But I think it's way less clear in what we do. And I mean, like you were saying with the sort of, the Iraq's bloody toll, how they use the inverted bar chart to simulate blood drips and stuff, which I know I brought this up. Andy Cochran and I had a debate about this once where Andy's like, I loved it, so effective. And I'm like, I thought it was so grotesque and offensive. Like, but it's like both of those are like, as long as you can sort of articulate where you're coming from, I don't think either is necessarily an unreasonable answer. And I don't think like my sensibilities should determine what should be made. But I think, people are going to do that. It's a very logical thing to do. I mean, the fact that they use the same wording, I think that brings it a lot closer to the idea of being a copycat and knocking it off. But at the same time, like, that's an iconic piece of work. It's like, it seems like an homage. And I just think we sort of lack the tools and maybe institutional knowledge of how we should be crediting these things. Or in many cases, like the example I had, like, you don't even know you're doing the same thing as someone else because sometimes it seems like a very logical chart choice.
Yeah. And then there's also the case where like stuff doesn't exist online anymore. Or like also like you have this like echo in your mind of, oh, maybe I saw this thing, but I can't remember who or what. So like I'm going to make my thing and go on. But I do like your point about making something and then maybe not being able to sort of suggesting that you have a skill that maybe you don't actually have, right? You have either a creative skill or a technical skill to build this thing where really all you did was download Zach's Tableau workbook. You're able to change the data, but you couldn't make it from scratch. And I think that sort of ends up revealing itself over time.
I think that stuff always comes to light fairly rapidly, particularly if you're sort of using that thing to, try to get a job. I think that's why so many jobs that are more technical in the field of visual intelligence literally require you to do some kind of work to demonstrate it. And I'm sure people fake that too and pay someone else to do it. But then when you get the job and you can't deliver for the first 6 months, it's not going to last that long. It's like, that's why it's important to work on developing your own skills and continually learning and progressing. Like, well, none of us may actually be able to own any of these charts, like at the end of the day, right? Like we're all sort of doing remixes of remixes of remixes. We understand what all the ingredients are, and your recipe is just a little bit different than mine. Like, well, at the end of the day, we may have started with the same data set and we created similar things that, show similar facets of the data. I don't know if I can really own any of that. It might be something I made, but I don't get to tell other people that they can't do the same thing.
Mm-hmm. So I'm curious, as we wrap up, I'm curious on this learning and progressing, what you are working on these days that you feel you are learning and progressing on.
Well, I think for me, I sort of alternate between hard skills and soft skills because I think the two are equally viable. And I think sometimes we put an overemphasis on the hard skills. So I've found that when I was in my periods of sort of very hard skill centric, you believe every it's like when you have a hammer, every problem is a nail. And understanding that you got two different lobes of your brain, however you want to look at it. There are many times when a client is asking for something, and really applying those soft skills and better understanding the business processes, understanding the players, understanding what they're asking. You may not even need a technical solution. Many times it's just better understanding the ask, understanding the user, understanding the need. Can really transform how you approach something from a technical perspective. So rather than immediately rushing towards, oh yeah, like I could write a calculation that could do that, or these two charts in conjunction can show this thing, start better understanding the people and the players. And it's something I have to relearn perpetually. And I think that's just maybe I'm Sisyphus, maybe I'm pushing that stone up the hill every day and just having to relearn stuff all the time. But it is funny how you'll feel very confident in one area and then you'll realize you're letting the other slide. So right now for me, I'm putting a lot of work back into people and understanding and that sort of thing. So that means the technical end will probably slip. I'll probably fall behind in some areas there and I'll need to play catch up at one point. But I've learned, for me at least, the two very rarely happen simultaneously. It's very infrequent that I'm able to develop both at a similar pace. Like I sort of have to alternate between the two. And that's not bad. That's just what it is for me. And other people may not have the same experience.
Right. Well, my friend, great to have you on the show. Where can people find you for more details on your work?
You can check me out on Twitter/X at Zach Bowders. You can check me out on LinkedIn at Zach Bowders and search for my Tableau public profile, Zach Bowders. I am also the host of the Data Plus Love podcast, where we have actually many of Jon's guests on too. We have we have similar crossover with highfalutin, fancy data folk, as well as your everyday ham and eggers like me, who are just out there making data happen. So if you want to explore the cross section of passion and data, check out Data Plus Love.
Awesome. Thank you, Zach. Always a pleasure to see you. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, Jon.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of the show. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you'll check out Zach's podcast, Data Plus Love. Don't forget, there's an episode with me featured in late September. You can check that out. Listen to him pepper me with questions. And of course, before you're done, just scroll to the bottom of whatever app you're looking on, be it Spotify, podcast, iTunes. If you're watching this on YouTube, like, subscribe, whatever you need to do. Let me know you're enjoying this show. And if you'd like to learn more about data communication, you should check out my Substack newsletter. It comes out every other week along with the show. So you get a preview of what's going to show up in the podcast along with a variety of other things. So until next time, this has been the PolicyViz podcast. Thanks so much for listening.